Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. It is a pleasure to welcome Rabbi Lerner. Rabbi, if you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you found us.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for having me. This is really a real honor and a pleasure. So, I'm brought up in the UK. I got into teaching a couple of years after I got married in Israel. I live in Ramat Bet Shemesh at the moment. I teach in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. What else? We met through the Chabura, I believe. The Chabura with Rabbi Derech's Chabura in London. I was part of that group, and I gave, I think, one of the talks on Tamia Mitzvahs and the Rambam in parallel to Rav Hirsch, and for that organization. And I teach the Rav Hirsch primarily online and in Jerusalem in different institutions, as long as the Kuzari and the Rambam. That's sort of my involvement in, well, I suppose on a more fun note, I'm also, besides my teaching efforts, I'm also a licensed electrician. So
Really?
that's what I do to make money, as they say. By the way, that always lights up my students when you're expecting the rabbi type of thing, and they're like, well, actually, I'm also an electrician, which is so counter what you would expect, sort of the intellectual abstraction and the ultimate grounding in I fix wires. It's a jump, which is a lot. My wife Rivka, she also teaches, but she's a programmer in the spare time. So I always say she does the intelligent. I smash down walls. She continues to deal with abstractions. Yes, that's how we have four wonderful children sleep upstairs, and thank God. That's how
Amazing.
we
Well,
involved.
you're a great example for people. That's the way to do it,
Yep.
work and learn and everything. So we wanted to get into the topic of Rav Hirsch. Before we get into it, just tell us why, because you reached out to us and you wanted to discuss Rav Hirsch, and we had an episode with Rabbi Eisen, and you reached out to us about it. So I want to just let the audience know a little bit about why we're discussing Rav Hirsch.
Right. So the topic emerged, or the reason why I thought it would be a good idea to discuss this, is because I believe the stimulus from my point of view is that often when discussions take place, specifically around the topic of aggadic and midrash, there's a modern voice that's often not spoken about, and that modern voice is Rav Hirsch, but also in the broader context of a grounded, relatable style of Judaism that Rav Hirsch offers us, that I thought would be a great conversation to be had, and also from the point of view of your audience and what they call this corner of the internet, the people who appreciate this perspective. I think the voice of Rav Hirsch could be a great addition or a great tool in their toolkit in approaching the world. And that's why I was excited to be able to, as I said, I spent a lot of time with Rav Hirsch. It animates and pictures my Judaism, so I thought it would be a great conversation to have. I'm a student of Rabbi Eisen. Rabbi Eisen also is a fan of Rav Hirsch, but the Rav Eisen really is a wonder at articulating the world of the Rishonim, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to discuss Rav Hirsch and some of his approaches, both abstractly, but also some of the ways that his ideas are relevant and I suppose useful in the world today.
Yeah, we were talking off camera with you about the fact that he kind of flies under the radar. Especially among Sephardim. I think that we want to know more, and we want you to hopefully make the case for why people should be focusing and paying more attention to Rav Hirsch. So if you could tell us also why this is something that is resonating with you so much, and why you've dedicated so much time with Rav Hirsch.
So that's a great question, and I suppose there's two sides of it. Why did I personally get into Rav Hirsch, and why does he resonate? So I'll start with why does he resonate? Because he's maybe I'll give a metaphor to articulate this. When I was teaching in London, there was and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but there was a tendency when I would give, I was teaching for an organization called the JLE in London. And one of my responsibilities was to give talks in banks and in law firms. So I would give talks. And I found a very, I suppose a sad, but a very difficult reality. You would have people who were very sophisticated in every area of life. They were sophisticated businessmen, and they were able to articulate their worldview in a very sophisticated way in relationship to business, into finance, into investments. But when they spoke about religion and Judaism, it was quite childish. It was quite childish, not in the sense that they didn't use, I suppose, sophisticated language, but their worldview from a religious standpoint was very undeveloped. And what I've seen was that when they were talking in the level of their business world, their worldview had sort of developed, but when they spoke in their religious context, it was still at the level of, I don't know, primary school. And I sort of, after having a discussion with one of them and speaking to these guys about it, I realized that there was always almost like a fear that if you look at your religious worldview with this new sophisticated worldview you have as an adult, you'll realize it doesn't make any sense. The worldview that you have now has grown beyond your religious perspective, and it doesn't make sense when you look at it through the lens of your more sophisticated worldview. So you sort of have to leave your religious worldview sort of in the realm of that it doesn't kind of have to make sense, and you can kind of I used to say to people, it's like it remains in the realm of Harry Potter. It doesn't have to make sense. The rules and the principles in your regular life don't have to develop in your religious worldview. And through discussing it with them, and this would come about through the type of questions, the sort of questions that someone would ask, that you would never allow such a question to be asked in your business meeting. But when it comes to religion, you could ask such a question. And through discussing this with them, and then integrating Rav Hirsch, I was able to find that through describing Judaism through the lens of Rav Hirsch, it allowed people and it allowed my students to ground the world that they lived in with the world of their religion. The world of the sophisticated worldview they had as an adult and the worldview of their religious perspective were able to marry rather than being two separate worlds. And that was my first, well, I suppose that was in my teaching life, but as an individual, when I first approached Rav Hirsch, it made sense. It made sense with my understanding of the world, but also my understanding of what I thought Judaism was. Rather than having to have this bifurcated vision where I had my religious worldview that didn't really have to make sense, and my sophisticated adult worldview, which made sense in I suppose the world that I was living in, Rav Hirsch allows you to marry those two worlds. You have someone who's writing post the Enlightenment, so he's experiencing the world through the modern lens, but he integrated religion in such a beautiful way with the use of language primarily to allow us to appreciate the world and religion together. So the sort of things he speaks about, the ideas he puts forward, the language he uses, it allows us to talk about religion in a way that keeps our vision of the world connected. You have the adult vision of the world where you are seeing the world in a rationalistic way where the world has to make sense, but then you're also able to look at your religious worldview with that same lens. You don't have to change your lenses. You can keep them together. So much so that when I was talking about, a good example of this is like reasons for the commandments. One of the dangers I found when speaking to people about Rav Hirsch's Tami HaMitzvahs, sometimes the stuff made too much sense, and that made people uncomfortable. It resonated too much. It was almost like a lack of mystery there. That was like, so that's it. I'm like, no, Rav Hirsch isn't saying that's it, but this is a way of walking through the world. This is a lens you can walk through the world that actually makes sense. That when you something as simple as taking challah, when you ask someone, why do you take challah? Why do you take challah off bread? Why do you separate challah? And people obviously sort of sideline into some sort of like, sorry?
Segulot and stuff like that.
They sort of, I would stop them and I would say, like, I don't mean this, I'm not being confrontational with them, but do you know what you're talking about? Like, what does, but then, and then they try and push it off. But then I say that what Rav Hirsch says is that, well, challah is the only thing you separate twice. You separate it in the field, but then you also separate it in your home. You separate in the field like all the other food to recognize and experience that God is in your life in the field. But then you separate it again in your home as a potent expression that God is present in your life, in your home, because the home is the focal point of the Jew's mission. And the person's like, that's rooted in halacha. That explanation makes a lot of sense, not only in a technical way, but and when I say Rav Hirsch's makes sense, I don't mean that he ticks a box. That changes your experience. And Rav Hirsch has the ability to not only make sense from I suppose you could say, an intellectual standpoint, but an experiential standpoint. You can sit in his reasons and experience the world in a richer, I would say, and I use this word in the technical sense, in a more enchanted way. Not with fairies and magic, but you experience the world that you can, that the Torah is trying to draw your experience with God in the world. Not in a imminent sort of like the challah has got magic inside it, but you, as the conscious experiencer, are bringing God into your life. And challah is that two-stage process, unlike any other food. And that makes challah something very special. And people are like, wow, that does make sense. That makes sense why challah is a special. And that, by the way, that's why when people, before they get married, they do a challah bake and etc., etc. This interpretation makes profound sense why that's a beautiful thing to do at that time. So why I love Rav Hirsch is that he has the ability to, and I compare him to the Kuzari on this point. The Kuzari was the poet and the philosopher. And that unique blend of the heart and the mind, that unique blend you had with the Kuzari, which is why he's such a pleasure to teach, you also have that with Rav Hirsch. You have the emotion, the groundedness in the world through symbolism, but also the need for it to actually make sense.
You articulated it beautifully, and I can sense your passion also, which is awesome.
So I've got to be careful my passion doesn't take over my ability to explain it. So
no, you're just fine. It's almost like people go about their religiosity in a way that sometimes it's almost like there's a cognitive dissonance between their religiosity and their general worldview, and it's kind of like they're just bouncing off of these two that doesn't fit, and you just kind of bounce between it, and what you're trying to say, I believe, is that you don't need to have cognitive dissonance with the way you approach the Torah and the way you approach your practical life. They're really one and the same if you have the right perspective.
You can let one blend into the other, meaning one can influence the other and backwards and forwards, which brings us into the whole synthesis of Rav Hirsch's idea of Torah im Derech Eretz. But can I maybe if I, it's actually, by the way, the reason why personally, this is a very much a side point, but for those of your listeners who are listening where this will be useful or interesting, I got into Rav Hirsch because I'm dyslexic.
Oh, really?
People are like, what are you talking about? My reading his work was because being dyslexic, I read very slowly, which is a difficult thing as a teacher. And when I'm under pressure, it's even worse. So you can envision I'm giving a class and I'm writing some sort of idea on the board. If I'm under pressure, it could be French at the end of it. So I've got to always be open with my students. But reading was very slow. And I came to this conclusion when I was when I first got I was trying to come up with a thinker that I could connect to. And I was thinking to myself, like, well, who can I connect to? And I was like, well, I don't want to read something that I have to read in a Hebrew translation with speed, because I'm always coming at it from a second standpoint. Now, obviously, I can work my way through the Hebrew, but it's always going to be far slower. English, I had more exposure to, but also I can listen to it. I can translate it to a PDF, and then from PDF, I can listen to it. So I was like, what about Rav Hirsch? I didn't really know much about Rav Hirsch, except that it was written in German, which means the best translation is English, meaning you don't want to have the translation in Hebrew is people can read it in Hebrew if they want to, but the language in English is richer. There's more words. We have access to more words than from Tanakh. So that was my exit drug or entry drug into Rav Hirsch. At that point, I got hooked. So I kind of make the joke from a hashgacha protist standpoint, which Rav Eisen would not be proud of this idea. But if tongue in cheek, I say God made me dyslexic to teach Rav Hirsch. Oh. So that's my joke on that.
That's an amazing take. I like that a lot. So just as another side note, we bring up Rabbi Sachs a lot because he's a big inspiration to us, and I feel like what you mentioned about being a poet and a philosopher, is something that kind of blew me away, because it totally just resonated with me. The first time I read Rabbi Sachs, I was just like mind blown. So I mean, in a similar vein, obviously.
Right. So by the way, you'll see a lot of parallel between both of their thinking. A lot of parallels. Rav Hirsch's 19 letters is quite similar in a way. Obviously, it's not written in a letter form, but the goal of Rabbi Sachs is a letter in a scroll, or radical then, radical now. The book that is like, I don't know if it should be an obligation for every Jew to read, but in the modern world, every Jew should really read that book. It's the same sort of thing that was being done. And by the way, this I think is one of those things that makes Rav Hirsch a bit of a shining light in the modern world. As I say, I teach, right? So I teach yeshivas and I teach seminaries and I teach in Tel Aviv, and they're all generally speaking between the ages of 20 and 30. That's my, and just in terms of, without going into Rav Hirsch's sort of more, his deeper philosophy, on a very basic level, you can ask someone, why are you doing what you're doing? Like, why? Like, why are you doing this? And Rav Hirsch gives language to that sort of question and that sort of approach to the world. And the way I frame it, I actually got this framing of Rav Hirsch from Rabbi Dr. Sam Liebens, which was a bit bizarre, but so and he has some works, some essays and some works of Rav Hirsch, and in the Rav Hirsch's 19 letters, he originally wrote it, which is actually his first book he published. He actually wrote Chorev first, which is just the insanity of that. He wrote that at the age in his 20s, and the publisher was like, I can't publish this because no one will read it because we don't know who you are. So write something else. So he systemized his philosophical worldview into the 19 letters, published it that first. It blew up to the point where Reform were using it as well. And then they produced Chorev. But in the 19 letters, he asks three basic questions. He says, what is Judaism's goal? Like, what's it trying to achieve? Is that noble? Now, people don't think that's a question, but it absolutely is a question. To quote Rabbi Sachs, where he quotes, I think it's Rabbi Yitzhak Rama, he's quoting, the question about why be Jewish is a new question. It's like there's Charles Taylor, a sociologist, wrote a book called The Secular World, where people talk about the idea of like religion and secular. He's like, 300 years ago, there was no such thing as secular. Like, you didn't have 500 years ago, if you would have asked someone, are you religious? They would have been like, am I part of the clergy? Like, being Jewish at a certain point, like being secular, became an option. When Judaism became an option, you then had to ask why. And Rav Hirsch says, why? What is the goal of Judaism? Is that a goal a noble goal? Does it call the better part of you? And then your last question is, how do the particulars of Judaism, mitzvot, fulfill those goals? How does it? Now, you'll see this idea brought out by anybody who gives Tami HaMitzvahs, but with Rav Hirsch, it's more explicit. And then when he lays out his categories of commandments, they seamlessly work towards his goal. So you live in a world where the world of your experience and the world of your action are in sync. There's a philosopher called Jonathan Vervecki, a profound thinker, I think he's in Toronto. He has this phrase that he calls worldview attunement, where your worldview and what you're doing in your world are attuned together. So a basketball player playing with a basketball player on a tennis court, that doesn't make sense. The worldview is not attuned with what he's there to do. A basketball player on a basketball court, he's fitted to his world. Rav Hirsch in the modern world allows us to be fitted to the world, that we are attuned to the world in a way that the actions that we're performing fit into the higher goal of what Judaism is trying to achieve. And that language of mission, of a calling, of a in the Christian context, I tell my students that when you read works of Christians, a lot of the work can be beautiful and profound. But the language that a Christian would use is carry your cross. You've heard that phrase as a metaphor for mission in life. Rav Hirsch was very specific at the beginning of Chorev. He calls it, the metaphor we use in, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. What's the parallel in Judaism? What's the parallel? Bear your cross. You can make that sound beautiful and profound. What is Judaism's
version?
Cross. Sorry?
What's Judaism's version of that? Yeah.
A yoke. A yoke. And if we think of the difference, one is about death. One is about death. And one has purpose. A yoke provides. It provides food. It plows a field. There is a reason. I know it's a agricultural metaphor, but it's such a beautiful metaphor because it's mission-based. There is a reason for being. It produces food. It produces a livelihood. That is what a yoke does. So when we are adopting the yoke of heaven, that sounds very like disconnected and grandiose. Rav Hirsch is like that. You're adopting a perspective. You are on a mission. There is a reason for you to be here, and that language of mission and of it resonates. I find not only with me but also with my students, which is another reason why Rav Hirsch is quite
beautiful.
Yeah,
absolutely beautiful. We wanted to ask you also regarding Rav Hirsch's thinking and how it helps modern Jews navigate their place in the world today.
So I'd slip into the point I mentioned before about this worldview attunement, but also perhaps we can use it as an opportunity to sort of segue into his classical slogan, which was Torah im Derech Eretz. Now, the beauty about Rav Hirsch, and like any great thinker, you'll have his interpreters, and his interpreters disagree, and that's a lot of fun. I mean, you'll love this because when it comes to Rav Hirsch, people are so passionate about him. They have to. He also has to. Makes how best to say this without being once again pejorative, and I don't mean it in everybody's trying to do their best, but when you're interpreting Rav Hirsch, there's a tendency to make Rav Hirsch you. That's a danger. The same way when it comes to the Rambam, people who interpret the Rambam, they often make the Rambam do what they want the Rambam to do, and obviously I can't escape my own biases. But a way that this emerges is in this slogan of Torah im Derech Eretz. What did he mean by that? But also it actually emerges fascinatingly enough in Kabbalah. Because you have these two schools of thought, like, did Rav Hirsch do Kabbalah or didn't he? Which is like, people are, why do you care? So, why is that interesting? Well, because if you're in the modern yeshivish world and you love Rav Hirsch has got to be a makubal. But he never mentions it. And when he does, he says it's like a spiritual resource, but it's taken over by magical thinking and goblins. How it's been usurped. But then people say, well, maybe he's only saying that because of his audience. And you get this weird sort of discussion that takes place of a person's original thinking. Why do I bring that up in reference to Torah and Derech Eretz? Because Torah, we know what Torah is, Derech Eretz. Well, what is Derech Eretz? And that's not a new phrase. And that wasn't a new phrase in his time either. So what did he mean by that as a philosophy of life and as a principle of education? And I think the reason why Rav Hirsch is to draw these ideas together. Have you heard of Mordechai Breuer?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. So he writes a fascinating essay, which I would encourage it's free online, on distilling Rav Hirsch's philosophy. And I always found it great as a gateway drug to Rav Hirsch, is because he often he's a good he's a good spokesman for Rav Hirsch, but also people know of Rav Mordechai Breuer. So the way he refers to it, and this is why once again I think it really connects to the modern world. He says Rav Hirsch's approach in a philosophical sense, as his educational principle to one side. What is Torah im Derech Eretz? Torah im Derech Eretz is you as an individual approaching the world through Rav Hirsch's understanding, the lens of Torah, which means you approach the world as the raw material that the Torah will give form to. In a sense, the world around you is part of your avodas Hashem. The world around you is the raw material in which you are supposed to live out your religious mission on, which means there's not really a secular religious split. He's explicit about this. There's no philosophy is secular, but religion is Torah is Torah. It's like, no, in an ideal world, your philosophy should be an integrated whole in your relationship to Torah. Your science, your sociology, your psychology, you should be able to merge it all together with your Torah to create, and this is the language of Rav Breuer, in a Hegelian synthesis. When people say that something is a synthesis in a Hegelian sense of the word, you get your thesis and you get your antithesis and you create the synthesis. But the synthesis is an expression of the two on a higher level. So the Torah, the Derech Eretz, and that includes culture, that includes good manners, that includes your job, that includes what is involved in being a good citizen in the world. And those two merge together to create a Jew. A Jew in the world, which means if this is a principle that you're coming at the world through, and you see, and people often, whenever I propose this forward, people are like, well, they say, well, either they say, well, no, it doesn't apply today, it only applies in 19th century Germany for some reason. Why? Because people look at the culture today and like, the culture is so terrible. He couldn't have meant it today. It's like, no, he also had difficult culture in his time. It's like a difficult culture emerged in the 21st century. So the reason why I think Rav Hirsch is so powerful as a thinker today is in a sophisticated, a nuanced way. He gives an approach of how we look at the world and integrate it into our lives with Torah, which means you have your mission as a Jew, the world that you're experiencing, and you draw them both together to create a higher reality, which we would call being a Jew in the world. It's not that you have your religious worldview and then you have your secular worldview. They should be integrated into one. To give a practical example of this, Schiller, which was a famous German poet, Rav Hirsch was enamored with. He wrote a beautiful hesped to his philosophy when he in his high school. But there was also thinkers that Rav Hirsch didn't agree with, philosophers he didn't agree with, and he didn't integrate their worldview. I always give the parallel today that you could think of thinkers in today's world that their worldview is kind of not is Torah, that's the wrong way to put it, but is the raw material Torah should be making use of. Trying to think of a modern philosopher, a modern thinker that would be Jonathan Haidt. Have you heard of Jonathan Haidt?
Yes, of course.
Jonathan, we can envision that you will be a better Jew in the world with that philosophy, that of moral foundationalism as part of your toolkit. You can envision that you would be a better Jew in the world through looking at the world with that as part of your toolkit. And for Rav Hirsch, then, it would be not just you could, it is an obligation then. You haven't got the ability to be the ideal Jew without using the best Derech Eretz of your time with your approach to Torah. Which means you look through the world almost like an investigator. What good ideas are there for me to integrate into my worldview? Now, obviously, if they counter a Torah perspective, they're not supposed to be integrated. That's obviously, that's clear. If you have and let's think of a good example that you wouldn't want to integrate. Michel Foucault, in his he's a postmodern philosopher. I think he was Jewish, but I'm not sure actually. But anyway, he had this idea that power dynamics were at the core of everything. Everything was power dynamics. You can envision that is not something that would synthesize into a Torah perspective, because the Torah would revolt at such a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
But if you I'm trying to come up names of the trying to think of another a very famous once again a Canadian thinker, Jordan Peterson. You can envision there are perspectives in his world that would be like, wow, I am a better Jew with this language. And then you synthesize it into what it means to be a Jew. Now, obviously, you've got to be careful. You've got to take advice. You've got to try and be humble. But you look at the world not as this external dead landscape where you as a Torah person are kind of walking through. It's like, no, the world is an integrated potential for you to use through your lens of Torah. And as you grow in your Torah, you grow in your approach to the world, you become a better person. And that makes you as like not an alien on the world. It makes the world a part of the story. It makes history part of the story. When you learn history, do you see the progression of history tending into a certain way? When things happen in history, you can look at them as a religiously significant. Not that you start interpreting history, but when you see things in the world and you learn about ideas and you synthesize them into your Torah perspective, you become a greater Jew through the process. And I think that approach of Torah Derech Eretz, articulated like that, I think could be powerful, once again, a powerful perspective that people can integrate. And Rav Hirsch gives such beautiful language, rooted in the sources, and he is passionate about giving this over, that I think especially people in our corner of the internet would find, if nothing else, just such great language to express ideas perhaps they already held before.
You know, it actually gives a lot of new perspective to a phrase that people just, I think, are very familiar with, which is Derech Eretz Kadma Torah, which is an idea that people usually associate with, like, okay, well-mannered, behavior, and so on and so forth. They don't really see it as the way you explained it. It's every aspect of the world, which is, you need the raw materials. So in order to have the Torah, the Torah has to be infused into those raw materials first. So if not, you have nothing to use. Exactly. It has to come with that. So I think that, that's just a very unique and I think powerful way of looking at it.
But by the way, just a side in a bizarre direction, Rav Sadia Gaon and I've been teaching Rav Sadia Gaon recently, and once again, it's one of those svarim that he's so modern. I mean, obviously he's not; he's 1,000 years old. But his language, he opens with an epistemology. with his way of approaching the world and the way we gain information from the world. And he has 4. And the last one is the tradition, meaning sense perception, obvious ideas, reason. And like students are saying to me, like, why is tradition the last one? I'm like, well, how did you come to the tradition? What led you there? What was the building blocks that got you there? You didn't wake up and like Judaism. Like the same way when it comes to, as you said, with Rav Hirsch. I think it's Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg from Montreux, I think it's Rediscovering, who in one of his essays about Rav Hirsch, it says uses in the Aristotelian sense. You have matter and you have form. The matter is the world. You can't have, meaning it's one of those things that when people who deny they have a philosophy are just not aware of their philosophy. In a similar way, that when you have the raw material, you can deny that you're using the raw material, but that's just another way of using the raw material of the world. You cannot escape it. And being conscious about that, it's like a person goes, I don't take anything in from the external world. Then you're just expressing your blindness, my friend. Look at it in a positive way. One of my teachers said that, like, what is more dangerous? Reading a philosophical work, let's say you're reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra from Friedrich Nietzsche, or you're reading something from one of the more existential philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, where he would write in the language of like a story, which is more dangerous. And people say, well, maybe Nietzsche, because it's like really dangerous. It's like his ideas could integrate into your world. He's like, no, the dangerous one is when you don't realize you're reading a philosophical work. That's more dangerous in terms of changing your perspective, and you're not aware that your worldview is changing. If you're reading a philosophical text, you have the correct guards up. Some ideas I will integrate, some ideas I won't integrate, because you're being conscious about it. You're living a conscious life. If you read a philosophical story, the danger there is that you will adopt ideas that you never would have adopted if they were written in treatise form. So it's the idea that you are integrating, whether you like it or not. The question is, can we do it consciously with the lenses that we think are the highest set of values that we want to use to decide what comes in and what doesn't come in? And that's, as you said, why Derech Eretz will have to come first.
You know, there's something unique. We just discussed this with Tzvi Goldstein. This idea that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but like, you know, the Rishonim, the Sephardic Rishonim specifically, they oftentimes wrote about Hashkafa, and we don't see it so much with let's say the Ashkenazi Rishonim and the like. But what's interesting is Rav Hirsch and Rabbi Sachs and everyone who you mentioned before, they're very much attuned to that and making us aware of these things. And I think that actually, you know, I think that's why Sephardic people, like many of our listeners, would probably resonate a lot with Rav Hirsch. So I just wanted to point that out. I think that it's an interesting thing that we noticed in our previous discussion. But the next thing I wanted to ask you was Rabbi Hirsch's approach to aggadic literature and midrash in the Talmud. I think that that's a topic that obviously that got us together because we were having a discussion with Rabbi Eisen and you wanted to speak about this. So we'd like to know more about that.
So the ideas of Rav Hirsch are not new. And by the way, it's interesting, when big thinkers say, like, I'm not telling you anything new. I'm telling you, I'm using different language to express similar ideas. And the same when it comes to aggadic, magic, miracles in the Talmud, science. He's not saying anything new. He's just perhaps using different language. And I would say the most important aspect of Rav Hirsch is he looked at himself primarily as an educator. Like, for example, a side point on this topic. When you've heard the term kiruv, right? People do kiruv. So I'm involved in new students coming to do interest in Judaism, and people say to me, do I do kiruv? I say, well, I could answer it in the same way, like in a very superficial way, but I say, no, I'm not. I'm a teacher. I show people my lens, and if they find it interesting, well, it's part of their tradition, they're more than welcome to it. And I feel a responsibility to display this lens. And that's what Rav Hirsch does, meaning Rav Hirsch uses language to be an educator. And that's the goal. We're there to demonstrate Judaism, meaning your responsibility in any educational context is to do your best to give the best lenses possible to Judaism. That's all you can do. You can't convince people to do anything, and God forbid you'd never want to. And that's true in Kirov in general, but also not to say that everybody approaches it like that. I do realize that. I'm saying my language that I use to this. But the same with Rav Hirsch. His language is so special. And just to give an opening into the area of Agadata, the first point that you realize when you read his essays on this topic is his humility, his recognition that we're dealing with the Chachamim, we're dealing with the sages of the Jewish tradition. And before he begins, especially considering he's going to be taking an approach that his interlocutor will not be taking, and he has to sometimes be very forceful about it, but he opens up with the importance of humility, of who am I in reference to the sages. And I find that such an important way of opening this conversation, because it almost like he waxes poetically about it, that we are mere grasshoppers in their shadows. Why is that so important? Because not only if you're going to be saying something that might, by some people, sound negative towards the Chachamim, you've got to make sure that you phrase what you're phrasing in the correct framework. Your framing matters. Because if I tell you that Rav Hirsch is X about Agadata, and we have listeners, well, probably not on this podcast, but in general, if someone hears that, I'm like, what? Like, you can say that about the sages? Well, no. The first thing is the humility on the point of Rav Hirsch, but also the greatness and the renown that he holds the sages in. And simply, when it comes to Agadata, I think the most important way of Agadata specifically is, Agadata is not Sinatic. That's the first point. It's not from Sinai. And that cannot be overemphasized from Rav Hirsch's standpoint. And he speaks about when we see Agadata interplay with the halacha, and he deals with them. And the person who wrote in the letter wrote 32 examples to try and show that no, halacha and Agadata, Rav Hirsch is like, the first and most important principle we need to articulate to our students, it's not Sinatic. It's not from Sinai. It's not a tradition from Sinai, which means the minute you blur the lines between a core principle of Judaism and Agadata, you do the worst disservice spiritually and educationally to our students. Yeah. Second of all, they're parables. But definitionally, a parable has multiple interpretations. And that's okay, because that was the genius of wise men. They would write in parables. But then to say that I found the interpretation and I got the answer of this parable or this metaphor or this allegory, that doesn't make sense, because the category of idea you're dealing with lends itself to multiple interpretations. So when it comes to Agadata and understanding Agadata in general, he's saying from Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Sharia Gaon, Rav Nissen, Rabbeinu Hananel, he's talking, and the Rambam, he's giving over these well-trodden ideas. But he's using language of, well, first of all, modern language, but also the language of humility and education. Humility in reference to who we are dealing with. And second of all, education. Why are we speaking about this? We're speaking about this because education to ourselves, but also education towards our students. Recognizing that when they come across ideas from Chazal that seem outlandish or difficult, you walk away with either them denigrating Chazal or them having a warped sense of Judaism. And I think the unique part he has to play is the modern language he uses. Obviously, it was in German, it's translated into English. But also, he frames it in a way that you're not saying, well, Chazal aren't literal. No, obviously that comes out from it. We're not taking Chazal in a literal way. And I understand there are different interpretations. There are some people that say no. Midrashim and Agadata, and I know there's a distinction between the two of them, but they are Sinatic. They are traditions from Sinai, and I'm sure you can find sources for that. But Rav Hirsch felt comfortable in saying, yes, first of all, that's not how things began. I mean, he wasn't actually talking to someone necessarily who was quoting people who were disagreeing with him. But his point is humility and the importance of education in talking about these ideas. But that in a more, not radical way, in a more like extreme way, parallels on to questions of miracles that happen in the Talmud. A person, let's say you got a student who, okay, I get you Agadata, but what about the Tana Shenachnai? The oven, where the Gemara that discusses the water going up, water going down, caves going in, this and the other. What do you do with that? And this, once again, this idea is so, the way he articulates this is so, he's like, I'm okay with that being a miracle. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, and he gives an interpretation like, why I haven't got a problem of understanding the stories in the Gemara as being miracles. I'm okay with that. But am I going to push aside someone who isn't okay with that? This is where he brings Rabbeinu Hananel as an example. Am I going to say I'm greater than Rabbeinu Hananel? That I'm going to be able to, and Rabbeinu Hananel gives an interpretation that was a dream about this, without going into the details, but the miracle didn't actually happen. Let's say someone's like, I'm struggling with that actually happening. If you're telling me it's a principle of faith, I'll cross that bridge. But really, like, I get Sinai. I get the splitting of the sea. Okay, I'm with you on that. And by the way, a whole topic about what do we actually mean when we say we believe these ideas? I think that's a whole topic in of itself. But let's say I say on whatever level it means that I can integrate them into my worldview. But this really, like I don't know, post the destruction of the temple, like really miracles, like that was actually happening. And Rav Hirsch is like, I'm gonna push him away. I'm gonna say that he's not part of the circle. And once again, the framing, the humility, and I can't stress that humility enough, because even if a person comes at this with no, everything's literal, you cannot walk away thinking that Rav Hirsch is being negative towards Chazal. And I often find when these conversations are happening, not enough emphasis is put on who we are dealing with, not in a way that we're making them into gods, but like these are the Chachamim of the Jewish people. And I think Rabbi Derech said so beautifully, you have to be a Chacham to understand them. We can't just assume we're all Chachamim, and then what do they mean by that? No, be a Chacham, and then look at the sages, and then decide whether you can what they're talking about. But that point that he opens up with the humility, the reason we're having this conversation is because of education. And then lastly, the canopy. Do I want to make everything a principle of faith? Like, do I want to do that? Is that a healthy thing to do? If something is, then let's cross that bridge. But if it's not, and I can show basis for other thinkers taking these sort of approaches, I might not agree with them, but that's definitely a path that people can tread.
Very well said.
Very well said, and very important. Very fundamental.
Oh, by the way, and just a little side point there in terms of magic. Once again, his approach to magic. Now, this is perhaps harder for some people, but he says, what about magic? Did magic exist? I taught a class on magic the other day, and people love magic. By the way, an interesting sociological point. People who claim that they're not religious, on reports, like the nuns, I think they call them, the people who say none they don't have any religion, about 80% of them believe in ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
Which is because in my sense, if I'm going to say, listen, I don't hold a religious worldview, the motivation for doing that would be my reason, my difficulty with integrating spiritualistic concepts. I would say, okay, no. And interesting enough, that's not the case. They're good with ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts, but I struggle with a religious perspective of integrating things I can't see and ideas. But people who say none to religion, 80% of them believe in ghosts, which I think is hysterical. But magic. What about magic? So Rav Hirsch says, to cut a long story short, am I going to put my head between two mountains, the Rambam and the Ramban? Does it make any difference to me in the here and now? But also, we have two legitimate perspectives in the Jewish tradition. Am I going to shove my head between these two mountains and say which one was true? And once again, that's once again widening the canopy. A person reads that and like, man, I love magic. I'm Harry Potter all the way. I love it. And that's, by the way, that's great. And there is there's a space within the tradition for you to be able to sit. And especially because even people who take that approach often would say it doesn't exist today. But the point I'm making is that a person who says that, listen, I can't integrate magic into my world, that doesn't make sense. There is a space for you as well. And the importance of having that canopy, being able to shade as many people as possible, I think is also an important principle that in a modern sense, especially when it comes to aggadic, magic, astrology, whatever it may be, is an important, valuable idea that Rav Hirsch gives us.
Yeah, I mean, as Sephardim, again, I'm going to say again that it really resonates because we come from a community that is, welcoming of different ideas. That's the way it's supposed to be. And I think Rav Hirsch, obviously he represents that because he's constantly, as you mentioned, he's constantly trying to make space for these different viewpoints. And I think that it's extremely refreshing.
So to damage my presentation just for a second, he was also a major kanoi. When he thought something was bad, he had this idea of cessation. He cut himself off from the rest of the Orthodox community because he felt they were compromising to reform too much, and people criticized him heavily for that. This idea of that. I'll give you a fun anecdote. You've heard of Abraham Geiger?
Sure.
Right. So he was a Ben bias in Rav Hirsch's house. Like what? Once again, that's an interesting historical point. But Geiger would give Abraham Geiger would write wrote an experience of him learning with him every morning. They would have a chavrusa shaft where they would learn Tosfos, Tehillim together, and then Kant. They would have a chavrusa in obviously all these important key topics. But there was one time where they were learning Hegel, and apparently Rav Hirsch got very upset about an idea and wanted to burn the book. And Geiger was like, "It's a library book." And he wasn't able. Meaning he had that like if something was bad, he had a passion for the bad as well as the good. So if something was uh 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 like the antithesis of what Judaism was holding, he would be clear about it as well and say, okay, beyond the pale, and I'm not integrating this. So I'm saying he had both sides as well. Meaning, so, yeah. So I thought it was a fun point. By the way, just another fun point. One of Rav Hirsch's grandsons, another fascinating thinker called Isaac Breuer. Rav Isaac Breuer. Now he's the one who was around during the beginning, the starting of the state. He knew Rav Kook. In his living room, he had two portraits. One of Rav Hirsch and one of Immanuel Kant. Like I say, like, and for people today would be like, well, that's insane. Why have you got Kant on your wall? But he'd be like, well, because Kant gave me tools that allowed me to understand Judaism in a way that that animated every aspect of his life. And it was like, it wasn't a bad thing that he happened not to be Jewish. It was okay. That was just where where the sage happened to be.
I feel like this also really helps if the whole idea with Harambam and Aristotle.
Yeah, just thinking that.
You were thinking that too? Like, it's always all this like controversy and hoopla, like Aristotle. Aristotle was a tool that was used for Harambam to articulate Judaism in a way which previously was not able to be articulated. Literally what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's it sidelines to the whole Chazal and science as well. It's and I understand there are different perspectives, but Rav Hirsch was pointing that Chazal, besides being masters in Torah, they were masters or they mastered, excuse me, the tools that they had in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to science, those tools change, and that's not being denigrated. That's the reality they were living with. So there are certain specifically when it comes to science, the idea of the longevity of tools obviously has an issue because our understanding of the natural world changes. But the conceptual tools we get from people and the way of approaching the world is as I said, you can envision the Rambam having a portrait of Aristotle. I mean, I don't know if he would do portraits, but you can envision the way he speaks about Aristotle. It's like this person knew the world in a way that, when I try and get people to appreciate the genius of Aristotle, and people find that difficult to really. We speak of the Rambam, and people don't sit down and go through the Nicomachean Ethics. I haven't either. But my point is, we don't really sit to appreciate the genius of these people. There's this idea called the square of opposition, which is a logical construct that Aristotle made. It's a way of illustrating logical relationships that Aristotle basically condensed all of logic into a box. And when you see that, and you're like, that is such genius to come up with this without going into why. It's called but it's once again, as you say, it's key tools that we use that without them, we are more impoverished Jews. And our ability to serve Hashem is impoverished.
Our teacher, Rabbi Maruf, gave us a class on Moreh Nevuchim. In the first class he gave to us, first class, I remember clearly, he was praising Aristotle, and he's like, people don't realize, but the way we go about everything, it's due to Aristotle. Logic, mathematics, science, or every single subject that is taught and used in every field of life was really because of Aristotle. Like we don't even know it, but like we're indebted with everything that's like, well, the whole modern world is built off of Aristotle's logic and his development of all these different subjects. Like you can't move without him, and you just don't know that. So you have to appreciate that. You can't just look at it as, oh boy, it doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? Like
Now that you brought up the, his scientific worldview, how does that relate to his understanding of Jewish texts?
So it's actually interesting. When it comes to Rav Hirsch and science, he was clearly enamored with it, but it doesn't actually. Obviously, his works, he speaks about it, but in a way, what makes his work so timeless is that he actually doesn't integrate science explicitly into his, for example, his interpretations of Tanakh, of the Torah and Tehillim. I'll explain what I mean by that. If we take something like, but I mean, it does and it doesn't. Perhaps this is a good way of explaining it. The danger of when you write, you let's say describe ideas from the Torah through a scientific lens. The danger is that the science will develop, and thereby your interpretation will become, just not interesting anymore. It's just not valuable because we don't look at the world through those lenses anymore. Unless you're like, as I said, unless you're as great as the Rambam, where your ideas are so valuable and universal, even though the scientific framework may have disappeared, his ideas still have their staying power. That's a rare thing. That is a rare thing. Rav Hirsch didn't integrate science into his understanding, except I think there's one time when he talks about soras, where he talks about in his when he talks about leprosy specifically, and he tries to show whenever Rav Hirsch gives a reason for the commandment, he doesn't just he approaches it in a scientific way. He has an hypothesis. He then investigates the hypothesis through the written and oral law, which means he needs his idea to thread its way out, not only in terms of its understanding from a symbolic standpoint of the Torah as it's expressed in the Torah, but also the Gemaras and Halacha. The more particulars he can bring together to make sense of his reason, the richer he finds his reason. And there's one time during Saras where he tries to show that it's not a natural ailment. Tries to show that people call it leprosy. He says our understanding of leprosy clearly isn't this. That is, I think, the only time he brings modern science into his interpretation in his Chumash. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have a place. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Take evolution as an example. Evolution, a contentious issue. And the same way when I say about Chazal and science and aggadic, I have teachers that I respect who take different views in this area, which is fair. So when it comes to evolution, how do you approach evolution? Because it was a hypothesis. In his time, it actually was. Does that make sense? Like nowadays, it's not really like that anymore. It's that people use it. Oh, it's only a theory. No, it's not theory like people think theory. But in his day, when it was first emerging, it was a new idea. And from a scientific standpoint, he says quite simply, well, if this gains traction and becomes accepted by the majority of the scientists, bravo, we'll show how this will be incorporated into our understanding of the Torah. Excellent. So, like, not a big deal. Just like, yeah, we'll just see how this idea integrates. But then how does that emerge in his actual Pirush on the Chumash? It emerges as a philosophical warning. What I mean by that is he will warn of the dangers of allowing evolution to become a philosophy of life. For example, the philosophy evolution as a way of describing the natural world, natural selection, working off genetic mutation. That's a way of describing the natural world. That's great, and there can be a beauty and a drawing towards God that can emerge through that. But if you then make it into a philosophy, you then come up with Herbert Spencer and eugenics. If you then use it as a way of viewing the world, you come up with Karl Marx and the lower form of life, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and the dialectic of history, and everything becomes natural. That he would warn against.
Yeah. And social Darwinism.
Exactly. And by the way, the language he uses, he then latches it onto, you'll love this, on Baal Pa'ar. What's Baal Pa'ar? In the story of Bilam and Balak, you have this him taking them to different mountain tops, Baal, and then you have the Sedei, I think Syrian, and then you have Baal Pa'ar. And he shows that each one of them illustrates a different way of trying to find an opening in the Jewish people's worldview, that he can draw God's eye at them. He says, what's Baal Pa'ar? Now, as kids, we all learn in religious schools, like, what's Baal Pa'ar? To obviously not be explicit, you basically go to the bathroom in front of it. And people are like, that's weird. Why would you do that? And Rav Hirsch says it's called the God of shamelessness. And Rav Hirsch says the factor that holds us to the moral law, to God's will, is to an extent our conscience, shame. But if I can erode that, if I can show I am just an animal and express that with a symbolic ritual drama through acting in a way that the entire natural world shares, from animal to plant to human, we all pass our waste. And he looked at that as a way of demonstrating you are just almost like a philosophical materialism, that you are just matter. You can express that through this idol and erode and practice eroding your shame to the point where you have none. And so you see a philosophical principle emerging from his point of view. You could look at it emerging from a scientific idea where we are just an animal. In the language of Darwin, after he wrote The Origin of Species, he wrote The Descent of Man. That Rav Hirsch would have found very dangerous, where you have the idea emerge as a philosophy, and thereby it also opens up to a whole conversation about what was so dangerous about, like, why was idolatry dangerous? Or why was it a bad thing? This is an example of where Rav Hirsch sees one idol illustrating something that is so morally corrupt, but not just morally corrupt. You train yourself in moral corruption as trying to level the playing field between you and every other part of the natural world. So that would be a way, and I'm pretty sure he uses the word social Darwinism. He uses the idea of Darwinism having a philosophical effect, where it really is a way of describing the natural world. So that, I think, is a good, perhaps a way of showing that.
You sold me on that. That Baal Peor explanation was phenomenal.
Yeah, by the way,
really interesting.
So the beauty about Rav Hirsch is his ideas are so good. I was saying to Rivka, whenever I'm not learning Rav Hirsch, I obviously learn other things as well. But when I always go back to him, some of his interpretations, they just, can I give you just another example? We spoke about midrash. We spoke about midrash. Like, how does Rav Hirsch interpret midrash? Good question. It's a good question. Now, he doesn't have a book on interpreting midrash, but when he quotes a midrash, it's a way of like integrating it into a symbolic idea. We just had the ladder, Jacob's ladder. We had the story of the ladder. So he said the ladder illustrates three truths. The first truth is that the goal transcends the natural world, meaning any meaning to give meaning to a system, the meaning has to come from outside the system. So against the heavens, that's the distinction between the terrestrial world and the world beyond. That's the first truth the symbol is giving over. So the second truth, and this is where the midrash comes into play. He says the angels are going up and going down. What were they doing? We have Chazal. The angels were going up, and they were looking on the throne of glory, and they saw Jacob's face engraved on the throne of glory. Beautiful. And they were coming and looking at Yaakov below. And Rav Hirsch sees that as the illustration of the world, that the ideal and how things actually are. And they are comparing the two. Thereby you get that oughtness, the world as it ideally should be, and how we are living out the world today. And then yeah, so that's a good example. And in this week's parasha, you have the wrestling match, and the Chazal talk about the dust that's kicked up, that reached the heavens and reached God's throne. It's like, what's that trying to? That's trying to say that what's happening here has historical and cosmic significance. You have the drama of Jacob wrestling, the story of the Jewish people throughout history, that we are damaged. We have no foundation, the foundation of power that every other nation has that keeps their survival. We don't have that because we are damaged. We have no foundation. And that principle that the Jewish people will still hold on, we will still hold on, has cosmic significance, because that is the story of the Jewish people. And that's Chazal using that language of it reaching the throne of glory to illustrate the cosmic nature of it. And the way he ends it, he says, what point do we hold on to? Why are we holding on? Until they bless us. Until the world, this is so beautiful, recognizes that what we've been doing this whole time has not been only for us, it's been for you as well. We're part of the same story. Until you bless us and recognize that we've been doing this for you. We've been doing this for all of us together as children of God. So yeah, sorry, yeah.
Absolutely stunning. Mm-hmm. Stunning. I love that. Wow. Amazing. That is powerful.
He's awesome. He's awesome. He's awesome. I can
You're great
wax.
at expressing it too. So
Yeah, excellent
yeah,
articulation. Articulation of fantastic.
we want to thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure. We learned a lot from you, and I think you inspired a lot of people to listen to study Rav Hirsch, and that's our hope from all this. And we want to also ask you where everyone could find you.
So I have a podcast on Spotify called Judaism from Within, which was Rav Hirsch's slogan, which a whole topic why that's his slogan. It's on the OU as well, where I teach Charev specifically, but this one I also integrate parasha ideas as well. Um, you had also Rabbi Yitzchak Adlerstein on your podcast as well. So
together with Rabbi Eisen, yes.
Right. So I do a podcast with Rabbi Adlerstein on, it's called Two Rabbis, Three Opinions. It's more of a schmooze on interesting ideas.
He's the man. He's the man. I love Rabbi Adlerstein.
He's like he's a so that's another podcast I do with him. And that's my I should mention I teach in Chappelle's and in Midrash Rachel and Midrash Tila. Those are the places that I teach that people might have heard of in case they want to check out on their websites. Guys, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. I really proper honor.
Thank you. And that I didn't know about this podcast you had with
I'm gonna check it out.
Rabbi Adlerstein. We're going to check it out, but that might be a great crossover podcast if you want to have him together, and maybe we can make it expand the schmooze.
For sure, because especially there's a very different audience that comes because he's got that whole other side of his life there. So it's that'd be cool. I'd love to mention that to him. Yeah, very cool. Excellent.
It was fantastic, Shavuot Tov. I just want to say one thing. One thing I noticed about you that jumps out at me, you when you talk about Rav Hirsch and when you talk about Judaism in general, I see like a joy comes out of you. Like you have a joy when you talk about Judaism. And if Rabbi Hirsch has enabled that in you, then that in itself to me shows like, that's it's worth looking into, and it's worth learning of Rav Hirsch's Torah, because I see the joy that you talk about Judaism when you're talking about it through his lens, and it's powerful. It's powerful.
Wow, that's humbling. Thank you. That's cool. That's cool. I appreciate that.
Very welcome. Shavuot Tov.
Shavuot Tov.
We hope to do it again.
Very cool, guys.
Hope that everyone will listen to it because it was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.